The first one I'd like to introduce is David Murky. Dr. Murky is entitled, his presentation is titled The Integration of Stormwater Management, Ecological Uplift and Resiliency across the board. He's a restoration ecologist with Green Vest. He has 20 plus years experience in the environmental restoration and rehabilitation field. In other words, healing the damage. He will discuss the problems of identifying distressed habitats and designing and implementing projects to provide the maximum social and ecological uplift practicable as a strategy for stormwater management. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you, David Murky.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you for your patience while I do this remotely. I had planned to be present in the auditorium with you, but had to go back to Michigan for family emergency. So I'm going to give my presentation, and then excuse me, Graham Boardman, also from Green Vest, is actually in the office today and will take part in the forum and question and answer afterwards. So when I originally put together the presentation and the title and the description, I intended to present, the stereotypical consulting firm list of examples of projects and pat ourselves on the back. But as I got more into it and putting it together and tried to be a little more thoughtful about what the goals of this particular forum are, I changed it up to be kind of an introduction both to the problems and introduction of where we are today and how we got here, and hopefully provide some thoughtful ideas on how we can move forward together. Just a little bit about Green Vest. We are a Prince George's County based certified small business. We are made up of, there's only about 25 of us or so, made up of ecologists, biologists, environmental scientists, and real estate professionals. And our business model is based on land and financial acquisition for restoration projects or improvement projects. And then we manage the design, permitting, construction, maintenance and monitoring, and the long-term management of those projects. And the one thing that I really like about Green Vest, and I had spent 20 years trying to find a place like this, is that we focus on the holistic approach of improving the entire ecological asset instead of just putting bandages on little areas where we have access to them. For example, like if State Highway needs to do a little bit of restoration for a culvert repair that has an impact to a stream, then they'll do a little bit of restoration, clean up the area around that impact, but that doesn't really do anything to improve the overall environment or ecology of the system. And that's one of the things that Green Vest focuses on. Now, how did we get here? Or why are we all here? I can't see you all, but hopefully you can see each other. If you have heard of the Chesapeake Bay, please raise your hand. Okay. I'm guessing that's most of it, most of the folks in the audience, right? So the Chesapeake Bay it's huge. It's the largest estuary in the U.S. It's home to over 3,600 species. It produces 500 million pounds of seafood and has economic benefits in the billions per year. And the other interesting tidbit is a lot of people focus on the cost of environmental regulations, and that it's 26 to 29 billion dollars a year that the regulations require. But the environmental benefit of that far exceeds the cost, meaning that the ecosystem itself provides a lot of economic benefit to us, whether that's in the form of seafood, or whether that's in the form of stormwater cleaning and water quality, or whether it's in the form of attenuating storm surges during hurricanes and other rain events. And if you look at most of us are used to seeing the bay from this scale. It's just what we can see around us. But a much, much larger area affects everything that goes into the bay. And the reason I point this out is that human beings often have a self-centric view of the world. Like what I can see is what affects the world. But in actuality, what affects water bodies like the Chesapeake Bay is much, much larger than our individual selves and will require a much larger group effort in order to fix some of the problems. Hopefully we can all agree off the start off, set the stage for some common ground. We can all agree that we love the Chesapeake Bay, but that the bay has some problems. And just one of the many examples is bottom oxygen levels. So the bay altogether has about 4,000 square kilometers or square miles, I can't remember off the top of my head, sorry, of surface area. And at any given time in the summer, about 1 to 2 of those acres can be what's considered a dead zone, where the oxygen level is so low that fish cannot live there. And they usually, if they can, migrate away. And any of the invertebrates, clams, oysters, and whatnot that can't migrate, if they can't hunker down and survive those low oxygen levels, then they're going to die. And you might think that, some might think that, oh, it's only like 1 or 2 acres, that's not a big deal. But if you're a fish and you're trying to get from the mouth of the bay up into some of these headwater areas to breed, that you can't get there. It is a big deal. Who's to blame for that problem, for those and the other problems that the Chesapeake Bay has? Some might say it's this guy, but it's not really his fault either. And this is part of going into the context of how we got here. Many, many, many years ago, it's not their fault, but beavers could be used to make nice hats. And as a result, many, many trappers and other folks moved up into the headwaters and trapped out the beaver. What that effect that had is that if you go all the way back to the 1600s, when the beaver trade started, there were over an estimated 300,000 square meters of created wetlands that the beaver did. That's about 10% of the continental United States. So what that means is that virtually every headwater area that drained to a stream in the United States had a beaver pond on it. And those had, as some of you may know, they accumulate sediment. They're great places for birds and wildlife to congregate. And then they have a very dynamic system or process of vegetation cycling over time, where the beaver come in, they clear out the woody vegetation, they pond up the water eventually fills back in with sediment and shrubs. As the beaver run out of food, they move out, a dam eventually breaches, and then the water level drops down, and then the vegetation can come back up. The woody vegetation comes back up, and then the beaver move back in. And that happens, over and over and over, all along the reaches of the river and over time. But by 1870, the beaver trade had ended because we had essentially extirpated all of them from the United States. In addition to that, what the impact of that was is that all those beaver dams eventually failed. They didn't have a chance to regenerate the way they would naturally because the beaver were no longer there to maintain them. And so they failed, and then head cuts started, and those channels started to erode in size. In addition to that, the colonial expansion with grist mills and land clearing, they put in small dams that also accumulated sediment behind them. But then over time, as we moved into the Industrial Revolution and coal replaces hydropower for the Industrial Revolution, those dams also started to fail, leaving behind what is called legacy sediment behind them. And as the dams failed, and again, the streams cut down through all that legacy sediment and eroded away. Additional damages to streams and waterways in the United States but in 1870, the Erie Canal construction just was an example of where we started large-scale modification of rivers for commerce. We went in and we pulled all the woody material out of them, we straightened them, we deepened them, so that we could get boats in and up them much more easily. And then by the 1800s, during the population boom of immigration in the United States after the Civil War, there was a lot of reconstruction, and as a result, they needed a lot of timber and wholesale clear cutting of vast areas began. What that does is that opens up the soil surface where it used to be protected by trees and forests and all of the leaf matter and leaf surface area. Now that rainfall just pounds down on the sediment directly, causes erosion directly, and it also causes the soil surface to become more and more impervious over time, so that more and more water runs off instead of running down into the soil or soaking into the soil. By the 1950s, urban migration had reached about 50%, meaning that like 50% of the United States population lived in cities. And as a result, the existing old farmlands that had been cleared were now beginning to become abandoned, and forests were beginning to establish on those old fields and on the legacy sediments that were in floodplains. And then in 1969, the Cuyahoga River catches on fire. And that, amongst a variety of other impacts to waterways, led to the passage of the Clean Water Act and beginning of the effort to try to clean things up and fix some of the problems that we had caused. But it wasn't until 1983 that Maryland was the first state to pass stormwater regulations, which focused on controlling flooding. Didn't have anything to do with water quality. So if there was a new development, instead of the development just grading everything out and trying to get the water to a pipe and then into a stream as fast as possible, now we've started to look at stormwater and say, well, all that stormwater that's running off quickly is damaging our streams. So we want to hold that water in place and release it slowly. It's called channel protection volume, so that it doesn't erode those stream banks the way it was. And then after that, the Clean Water Act was amended to start to cover stormwater, which it hadn't before. It would only cover industrial discharges. And it wasn't until almost the turn of the century when the EPA started to regulate stormwater as part of the phase 2 National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits. And then since 2000, we've started to develop some tools like environmental site design. We've established the Chesapeake Bay TMDL to put the bay on a quote unquote pollution diet to reduce the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment that is discharged into the bay. And then most recently, along with the environmental site design that starts to treat water quality instead of water quantity, we've also started to use what's called stream restoration for sediment reduction recommendations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that word restoration. It really bothers me because, and it has for years, because what if you're going into a stream or a wetland or any other, like even a forested system, and you say you're going to restore it, it's not a very precise term, and it creates different ideas of what the end outcome is going to be in different people's minds. And I think that especially in cases like this, words really, really matter. Because if we say, oh, we're doing a stream restoration project, what are we restoring? And what are we restoring to? Are we restoring back to 1969 so that the river can catch on fire? Are we restoring back to large scale clear cutting and all the runoff that came from deforestation? Are we restoring back to putting in canals and removing woody debris from the streams? Or are we going to restore all the way back to what the conditions were in the 1600s, and then as a result move all of the people, communities, farms, etc., that now are in those headwater areas? Are we going to move them out and reintroduce beaver? And that goes that doesn't even address all of the issues with species loss and rare, threatened, and endangered species, and the changes to the climate that have happened over time. So the term restoration, I have a big problem with. I think we'd be much better off as an industry, as a group, as a society, being much more specific in our language of what we are actually trying to do. Are we stabilizing banks? Are we protecting utilities? Are we actually like going to look at an entire watershed and see if we actually can restore some of the ecological function back to those? It's not going to be a restoration of the conditions that happened before. We're going to try to make it as best as we can now, given all of the other things that are going on. But I don't have a term for that. And it's something that I hope that we can talk about further, not necessarily today, but going forward. Because we have been beating up our streams and waterways for a very, very, very long time. There's this particular example of the hydro mining happened more out west as part of the gold rush, but it's an example of like the scale of damage that we have caused. I mean, there used to be a forest up on the top of that bluff, and all of that sediment, all of that material has been washed down into a stream or wetland somewhere. And it's still, it's still there, or has continued to move its way down through the system. And we have fortunately largely gotten rid of the point source pollutions, but they still occur. There's still what are called illicit discharges or illegal discharges, and you'll hear about them on the news where somebody has dumped, X barrels of oil through a storm drain, or to use the example that David presented of not following the erosion sediment control regulations the way that they're supposed to, and contributing all that sediment downstream. Here's an example. This is the Cuyahoga River fire. If you haven't heard of it before, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio was so polluted that it just spontaneously caught on fire. So as a result of that, and other examples of degradation of streams over time is we just take them and put them in a pipe and then build houses over the top of them and wonder why those houses end up flooding during big storm events. But that happened all over the place. And you can find, if you Google Baltimore's hidden streams, there's a whole host of streams that ran down into the city of Baltimore that during the 1800s, when they were more or less open sewers, people complained about the smell, and so they just put them in pipes and covered them over. And that sort of thing, even though we've made great strides in our environmental regulations, it continues to happen today. So for example, this is a GIS exercise that was done by Andrew Elmore, where he looked at a section of Loudoun and Fairfax County down in Virginia, and he looked at the stream networks and associated with development over time. And so the first slide up here shows very little development, has green areas with lots of forest cover, open fields, and the gray areas are urban development. And the red streams here are streams that have probably been put into a pipe and covered over as a result of development. You can see over in the 90s, there's a lot more gray, more and more development is occurring, and more of these streams are becoming piped systems. And then by 2001 and 2006, you can see that almost the entire area that he was looking at is impervious, and all of these headwater areas have been converted to piped systems, and either completely piped or piped in sections. And as a result of that, they lose their connectivity to upstream and downstream reaches, so that the aquatic life, fish and macroinvertebrates can't migrate up and downstream as easily. And they also lose all the water quality functions of floodplain connection and sediment retention, and nutrient cycling that they would normally perform. In addition, during the construction, or sometimes if the infrastructure is not maintained properly, there will also be a lot of erosion around those features that doesn't get a chance to become stabilized And so you're just dumping a bunch of sediment and nutrients into a pipe that eventually makes its way down into a waterway. And so as a result of our legacy of abuse and degradation, this is from a cartoon from Walt Kelly from the 1970s, right around the time the Clean Water Act was signed, where people finally realized just what we were doing to the environment and to our waterways as we had been treating them, and that we had to do something different. But as a wise man once said, significant problems that we have cannot be solved at the same level of thinking with which we created them. Meaning we can't just look again at the site level, go in, bulldoze it, build a house, shove the water in a pipe at a scale that you yourself can see. Doing those piecemeal things is not going to help. It's not going to fix the problem. So in 1969, 1972, the government passed the Clean Water Act, and that was the very first time that we actually had regulation that set up the structure for regulating pollutants and water quality and setting water quality standards. Before that, you could just dump whatever you wanted to in a stream or a wetland, and there was no consequence to that. But as a result of this, it became unlawful to discharge any pollutant from a point source without first getting a permit. And I wanted to point out there's a variety of different sections of the Clean Water Act that do a whole host of different things, but there's two that are used most often in the more or less in the day-to-day industry of water quality. And one of them is 402. That's the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System portion of the Clean Water Act, often called the NPDES. And that was the first time that we could actually monitor and regulate the discharge of wastewater or stormwater into surface water. And all of these permits are written to ensure that the nation's receiving waters will achieve specified water quality standards. What that means is that the EPA and other agencies go out and assess each individual waterway, determine what the impacts are, and determine what's causing those impacts, and then starts to set levels for reductions to reduce those pollutants and reduce those impacts to try to improve the water quality. Section 404 is the section of the Clean Water Act that regulates discharge of dredged or fill material into waters of the United States, including wetlands. 404 allows for development within waters of the United States and requires mitigation to offset the impacts. A lot of times people confuse these two sections, but they do completely different things. If you're, for example, doing a water quality project to address stormwater as part of the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System section, that does not mean that a developer somewhere else gets to fill in a stream so that they can do a development. They're completely separate. If a developer or a state highway or somebody needs to put in a culvert or damage a stream or whatnot, they have to do mitigation for that impact at this time. It's not about going back and fixing the sins of the past. In Maryland, the EPA has delegated the NPDES authority, including the municipal separate storm sewer discharge system, to MDE. And under section 402, what that means is that the MS4 program sets the requirements that permit holders restore and maintain the chemical, physical, biological integrity of the nation's waters. That means we have to prohibit pollutants and stormwater and unauthorized discharges to the waterways. It means we have to reduce stormwater pollution to meet the water quality goals. We have to actually treat the water and stormwater instead of treating the quantity. We now have to treat the quality. It also requires that we restore poor quality streams by reducing pollutant loads. And studies have shown that the amount of sediment that comes from stream banks, especially from headwater streams, can be 70 to 80% of all of the sediment that is discharged or that runs downstream. And we often, as ecologists and environmentalists, focus on the impervious area where water, hits a parking lot or a rooftop and collects a little bit of sediment and nutrients and from atmospheric deposition and washes that water into a waterway. That is one mechanism, and it does contribute a lot of pollutants, a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, and a lot of sediment, especially suspended sediment, to streams. But the bulk of the sediment is actually coming from the stream banks. Other activities that help meet water quality protection goals is that are included in the MS4 program is that the permit holders have to reduce the amount of trash and litter on a countywide basis. They have to develop and implement public outreach and education programs. They have to conduct preventative maintenance on all of their stormwater management facilities. And they also have to implement laws and programs to reduce stormwater and pollution. So we're now beginning, at the turn of the last century of 2000, now we're beginning to actually look at the bigger picture, not just focusing on site-specific solutions to bigger problems that we've created as a society. Now we're starting to look at public education and outreach, looking at some of the other issues like trash and litter, and starting to implement programs to actually make sure that the fixes that we put in place, like the stormwater facilities, are actually functioning. This is a duplicate. I already talked about how restoration, this side was in here to kind of hammer home the idea of what we are restoring and what we are restoring to. And taking just as an example of the duration of time, the box here is since the Clean Water Act was signed in 1969, 1972, up to the present day. So this little tiny box represents the amount of time that we've trying to do something to clean up our waterways. Meanwhile, for the past 300 years, 300 to 400 years, we've been beating on them in one way, shape, or form. And so we have a lot of work to do. We're not going to be able to fix 400 years worth of damage in a 50-year time span. It's going to take a while, and it's going to take some serious thought, but we're making progress. And the fact that all of you are here today to learn more about this and have a desire to make things better is a demonstration of that. As an example of what remains to be done, yes, we signed the Clean Water Act, yay us, whether you like Richard Nixon or not. He did sign the Clean Water Act, so he at least gets some points for that. But we still have a lot to do. We have not dug ourselves out of the hole. This is a stream in Prince George's County. And there actually is a stormwater management facility upstream of it that was functioning for a while. It eventually failed. And as a result, you can see Jack down here at the bottom. Jack's about 6 feet tall. And so these banks are 25, 30 feet tall, and they are still incising because the sediment that's in these banks is so sandy and coarse that anytime water comes through here, it just chews away at the bottom of the bank. And then all this stuff just continues to fall. And that's been going on for years. And it's not gonna, when it gets to be something like this, it's not gonna heal itself. We need to get in there and do something. We can argue about what that is, but I think we can all agree that this sort of condition is not acceptable. But again, the fix is not as easy as it may seem. Many of us in the crowd and have probably seen figures like this, where under a natural system, you have most of your rainwater goes up and evaporates, or there's only like 10% of it actually runs off to streams. The other 50% either goes into shallow infiltration that is then taken up by plant roots, or it goes into deep infiltration if you have a natural cover. And then in a urban system where you have impervious surfaces and much lower amounts of native cover, you end up with a much higher amount of runoff, much less evaporation, and much less infiltration, either shallow or deep. And what that means is that all of the water, whereas in before, only 10% of the water would run off and rather slowly through grasses and trees and stuff before it reached the waterways. Now we're taking about half of the rainfall, shoving it into a pipe as quickly as we can, and then dumping it into a stream channel. And it's no wonder that the banks and the streams that were used to only 10% of the runoff get beat up when you shove 55% of the runoff in them very quickly versus 10% slowly over time. So how do you fix that? I imagine that many of the folks in the audience, especially in the architecture program, I have a master's in landscape architecture, so I don't think I'm criticizing any of the folks here, but this is a great example of some of the things that we can do. We can put in permeable paving. We can put in perforated and porous pipes to help with infiltration. We can put in rain gardens. We can put in swales. Yes, we can. If you're building a new city, or if you're building a brand new, if you're like going in and tearing up an entire street where you can actually relocate the utilities that are existing there. There's like electrical utilities because they put all of the electrical underground usually in big cities these days. There's also all of the sewers and water mains. All of that either needs to be relocated or worked around, in addition to just the amount of time and impact to tear up the street and the sidewalk and make all these improvements. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that that's great if we can do it. But and you may also have seen like pictures of new housing developments with lots of open space and lots of little trees planted and points located on where you could put a rain garden in here, and how great it would be if you put a bioswale there. I want people to think critically about that kind of stuff, because if you have a brand new development, that means, one, that it was probably a forest or a farm field at one point, and now it's been converted over to a residential area, or increase the impervious surface. So that's not an ideal situation. And two, if it's a brand new development, we now have the stormwater regulations in place that require surface water to be treated back to this 10% level. So if you have a new development, you now have to take a look at the existing area and estimate what the runoff would be under a completely forested condition, and your stormwater to that level before you can discharge it off site. Older systems, cities and older established neighborhoods don't have that requirement, and they are the bulk of the problem. So this is one way to fix it, but it's not a panacea. It's not going to do all of it. And also, what do we do for established neighborhoods? Places like Baltimore or New York City, where you have the impervious surface from the edge of the building all the way across to the other edge of the building. Are these folks going to want their street torn up for X amount of time to have new stormwater management put in? Is there even a place to put it in? Are they going to allow all of these street trees to be removed and have that happen? Yes or no? I mean, they might, but that is something that we need to take a hard look at. Similarly, this is a screenshot of or photo from Tacoma Park, which many of you may know is a very progressive, very forward-looking community in the Washington, D.C. area. But again, there's limited space for doing some of those types of projects. You can put them in there, but you have to worry about too much infiltration of groundwater, behind the walls because you get freeze thaw, and then you affect the stability of the walls, and so on and so forth. And then we also have differing opinions. Like everybody in this room probably agrees that we need to do something to improve our stormwater quality. And we probably all have some sort of thing at home that helps, whether it be a rain barrel or a rain garden in our front yard, or we've removed chunks of our lawn and converted it to more of a natural community. All of us can agree that we need to do this sort of thing to make things better. But not everybody in the United States and elsewhere agrees that that's what we should do, or that's how we should do about it. Some people like their grass and they just want to look at their lawn, and they want to over fertilize it, and they want to make sure that it doesn't have any dandelions growing in it. We need to do a lot of education and outreach in order to get those folks over onto our side. And it's been a little while since the rain tax argument, but it illustrates the point that not everybody's on board with the amount of effort that it's going to take to fix some of these problems. And then lastly, the photo over here on the right, or the picture on the right, just illustrates that not all of the utilities run in these nice straight parallel lines that would facilitate the implementation of some of these facilities for stormwater management. We have utilities that run in parallel with the street, but then there's also a variety that run back and forth, crisscrossing the street. So there are opportunities and there are spots where retrofits can happen in existing communities to improve stormwater management. But and there's if you drive down Dennis Avenue or Arcola Avenue, or if you go to there's a neighborhood off of Piney Branch where they've done a really nice job putting in as many of these facilities as possible, but it didn't solve the problem completely. It's kind of a step toward solving it.
Dr. Murky, thank you very much for your presentation.